It was the kind of secret that Fernwood had buried in its soil long ago. Too quiet, too dangerous to ever resurface. But when a single red thread was found caught on the edge of an old garden fence, the truth began to unravel, and nothing in the village would ever be the same again. Secrets have a way of returning when least expected, and this one had been waiting patiently, just beyond the reach of the eyes that had ignored it. The question was, who would be brave enough to see it through to the end? The village of Elmsworth carried the sort of enchantment that painters long to immortalize. Yet their canvases always fell short, for no brush could capture the way the fog seemed to whisper secrets through hedgerows, or how ivy stretched over stone as if reaching toward hidden truths. Weathered chimneys sighed smoke into the spring sky, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth, rosewater, and something more elusive, something almost watchful. It was on such a golden afternoon that the Elmsworth Needle Circle gathered in the sun-dappled parlor of Agatha Hemsley's vine-wrapped cottage, where teacups clinked and tongues moved faster than the needles threading their work. The room was a tapestry of warm cushions, polished wood, and flickers of nervous laughter stitched between every word. Seated quietly by the window, where the light caught in her silver-streaked hair, was Miss Elowen Gray, a woman of soft voice, sharp instinct, and a past as quietly folded as her shawl. Her fingers worked methodically on a piece of midnight blue silk, but her attention was not on the thread. It never really was. Most peculiar, said Agatha, slicing the sponge cake with an unnecessary finality. The butcher swears he saw Imogen Vale at the Belmere carriage stop just past noon. But I had marmalade from her own hand delivered at 4. Unless she's taken to teleportation. A soft titter followed, though it rang hollow. Clara Dunn gave a shaky laugh, but her eyes betrayed unease. Imogen had been distant of late, pleading insomnia, and a commissioned tapestry for Baroness Whitlock. Yet no word had come from the Baroness, and her manor gates remained mysteriously locked. She's always had a flair for drama, muttered Irene Marsh, her hands fumbling with a pattern that spiraled too tightly. Elowen paused her stitching long enough to notice the tremble in Irene's hands, the ink smudge on her wrist, and the faint scent of camphor clinging to her collar, fear masked in lavender. The conversation turned to safer grounds. Lemon curd, the vicar's misbehaving terrier, and strange midnight flickers seen in the woods near the Vale cottage. But Elowen's gaze caught something, a spool of red thread hanging off the mantel barely swaying, its edge frayed like a scream stifled too soon. Found that yesterday, Agatha said, following Elowen's line of sight. It was wedged into the banister, snapped clean when I pulled it. Must have come from someone's sampler. Funny the things that linger. Elowen smiled, but her voice was distant. Threads remember what we forget. All we have to do is listen. The room hushed, not entirely, but with a taut stillness that pulsed under the surface. And then, as if summoned by something unspoken, Irene's teacup slipped from her hands and shattered, scattering porcelain like brittle truth. That evening, as dusk sank its teeth into the hedges and birdsong fell quiet beneath a rising chill, a scream tore through the still air, thin, sharp, and unmistakably human. It came from the far end of Elmsworth Lane, where Imogen Vale's cottage stood draped in ivy and silence. By the time the constable arrived, boots thudding against the dirt path, the door stood open just a crack, enough to let in the cold. Inside, Imogen lay hunched over her tapestry frame, her fingers locked around a crimson thread that wound tight through the unfinished fabric like a warning frozen mid-breath. Heart gave out, they said. Natural causes. But Elowen was there moments after, her slippers barely stirring the air. She stepped inside, glanced once at the tapestry, at the needle halted a breath before its final stitch, and whispered, not to the room, but to something deeper, unnatural. Behind her the breeze stirred the red thread once more, not wildly, not enough to draw notice, just enough to suggest it had never really stopped moving. In the ivy-clad hush of Merrow Vale, where whispers traveled quicker than the post and curtains twitched at every footfall, the news of Clara Fenwick's sudden silent death dripped through the village like a slow leak from a cracked teapot. One no one remembered placing but everyone sipped from. That morning, as the grey light pressed against rain-smeared windows, the ladies of the stitching circle sat clustered in Elsie Braithwaite's parlour, their cups clinking faintly like distant bells tolling for something not yet named. She passed in her chair. Dora Picknell murmured. Not quite to anyone. Her fingers jittering over a battered pastille tin. Nails flaking red like dried blood. Thread wrapped tight around her wrist. Eyes wide, like she saw something that wouldn't let her go. The silence that followed was not quiet. It was loaded, trembling like the pause before a thunderclap. Then came the slam of the front door, and Annie Moore's entrance, cheeks flushed from wind or worry. Nobody could say. She tossed her damp newspaper onto the hearth with a sigh that rattled the doilies. It was natural causes. Heart, they said. Constable was quite clear. Her voice was brittle, too practiced. And when she said heart, it didn't quite land. It scratched. From her place near the pantry shelf, Miss Cressida Vale, known more for her punctual jams than opinions, blinked once slowly. She had just selected a jar of elderflower preserve. But now she listened, eyes steady, catching the discord in Annie's tone, the imbalance between her sharp certainty and the soft lie stitched underneath. Dora leaned forward, her voice gaining courage from the shared hush. But Clara wasn't ill, was she? 53. Walks every morning. Drinks only dandelion tea. Just last Wednesday she was shouting at Mr. Booker at the butcher's over the weight of the gooseberries. She did look flushed, Elsie offered, brushing crumbs from her apron like she was wiping away guilt. I thought it was just the heat. Did she say anything unusual? Cressida asked gently, her tone like warm wool, soft, comforting, yet capable of smothering. The others looked at her with faint surprise. Cressida rarely spoke unless about apples or jam jar seals, only about her new curtains. Annie said, blinking too fast, said they let in unwanted eyes. I thought she meant the new postboy. He does stare. Miss Vale's brows rose just a fraction, enough to register the phrase. Unwanted eyes. Odd. She didn't ask more. She preferred her questions like embroidery needles, sharp, hidden, and drawn only when the fabric begged for it. By noon the village was saturated with whispers. Some said Clara had swallowed a needle. Others swore she'd been poisoned by foxglove tea. There were stories of a torn letter found on her lap, of strange humming heard through the window. No two accounts matched, yet all agreed on one thing. Something about her death itched at the corners of their minds. Reverend Allah, calm as clock chimes, and equally predictable, stood in his lemon grove sipping lukewarm tea from a chipped mug, urging restraint. Let us not fall into speculation, he murmured, voice barely audible over the wind. Leave judgment to the Lord. Of course, Cressida replied from the stone bench beside him, hands clasped in quiet elegance. Though it is curious, isn't it, that the front door was ajar. The Reverend turned too slowly. I beg your pardon. Constable mentioned it, she said lightly. Clara was precise. She once sent back a jar of jam because the wax seal had bubbled. I can't imagine her leaving a door open to the night. The Reverend chuckled, but the sound cracked at the end like an old floorboard. His gaze slipped from hers. Cressida said nothing else, but her eyes lingered on the tremble in his jaw. That afternoon, beneath a slate-grey sky that smelled faintly of tin and thyme, she walked alone to the Fenwick cottage, clutching a small jar of rosehip cordial. The constable, young and nervous with boots too big and authority too small, straightened when he saw her. Miss Vale. I'm not supposed to let anyone in. Of course not, she smiled gently. I only wished to leave this. Clara never liked shop-bought cordial. He hesitated, then nodded. You can leave it by the gate. She placed it down carefully, but as she did, her gaze slid toward the window. Inside, barely visible through lace and shadow, she saw the silhouette of a table, thread scattered across it like a red stain. The embroidery hoop knocked to one side as if something or someone had interrupted mid-stitch. A cushion had fallen to the floor, not flung, not tossed, just inverted. Wrong. That night, the stitching circle reconvened in Dora's cottage, heavy with lavender oil and uneaten lemon biscuits. The women stitched half-heartedly, needles trembling like whispers too afraid to speak. She never finished her garden sampler, Elsie murmured. threading her needle with a care that bordered on reverence. Roses. Lavender. A little iron gate at the back. She said it reminded her of peace. Cressida didn't respond. Her eyes were on her own sampler, but her mind was in that darkened parlor, with the open door, the toppled cushion, the red thread, and Clara Fenwick's frozen eyes. The garden gate had been embroidered open, and winding through it, a single strand of scarlet, like blood, or breadcrumbs. Clara Fenwick had always been meticulous, her every stitch deliberate, her every pattern precise, a woman who believed that unfinished business was an affront to the very fabric of existence. Yet, as Mrs. Pratt clucked her tongue, a slight quiver in her voice, she muttered, "She always said she wouldn't leave a pattern incomplete." The words hung heavily in the room, the kind that resonated with a sense of ominous finality. Miss Marple didn't reply, her fingers pausing mid-stitch, the delicate ivy motif on her embroidery hoop stretching out in perfect symmetry. Her glasses shifted as she adjusted them, eyes narrowing just slightly, not out of suspicion, but because, in that quiet moment, her mind was already working, tracing the threads of something far darker than an unfinished sampler. The ajar door, the tangled thread that seemed deliberately pulled, the overturned cushion, and that peculiar remark about unwelcome eyes, it all added up in the fabric of her thoughts, weaving a disturbing tapestry she couldn't yet unravel. It was as if Clara's death had arrived dressed in the quietest of patterns, subtle, ordinary, and yet disturbingly wrong. Death, Miss Marple mused, had worn the face of Fernwood itself, familiar, unassuming, but with a thread pulled where it shouldn't have been. The village, peaceful as it appeared, seemed to pulse with an undercurrent of unease, a sense that something was amiss, and had been for far longer than anyone realized. The next morning, the sky hung heavy with the promise of rain, a grey veil that seemed to mirror the shroud of secrecy over the village. Miss Marple, contrary to popular belief, was not one to sit idly by, waiting for mysteries to land in her lap like autumn leaves. She preferred to observe, to move quietly through the streets, letting the village reveal its secrets to her. Today, her walk took her past the old shuttered Fox cottage, and down the churchyard path toward the grocer's, when she spotted Mrs. Annie Pratt standing in front of the post office, her fingers pressed tightly against her neck, eyes scanning the notice board with unusual intensity. Miss Marple stopped a few paces behind her, watching as Mrs. Pratt's face tightened, her gaze fixed on a new addition to the board. Fernwood Quilting Society's spring exhibition. Postponed. When Mrs. Pratt finally noticed Miss Marple, her brittle smile was quick, but her eyes didn't match it. Too guarded, too tight. "Oh, Jane didn't see you," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "Dreadful about Geraldine, isn't it?" Miss Marple returned the smile, warm yet calculated. Quite dreadful indeed. She was meant to exhibit her Fernwood garden piece this year, wasn't she? Mrs. Pratt's face twitched, a barely perceptible movement that spoke volumes. "I saw it once," she stammered, her hands suddenly fidgeting with her shawl. "Half done, of course. Lots of roses, little sparrows, very detailed. You know how she was always so exact." "Yes," Miss Marple nodded, her tone casual but measured. "Very particular indeed. I suppose that's why the unfinished edge surprises me. A single loose stitch, almost abrupt." Mrs. Pratt's mouth opened, then closed, as if she'd intended to say something, but the words slipped away, leaving only the faintest tremor in her hands. There was more here, Miss Marple knew, far more than Mrs. Pratt was willing to admit. Later that afternoon, in the quiet corner of Harrington's tea room, a modest establishment with pine tables and lace curtains, Miss Marple sat sipping her tea, eyes darting around the room as she listened intently to the whispered conversations around her. The murmur of voices was like a low hum, and she was a spider in the web, waiting for the right vibrations. Behind her, Dora Lytton and Reverend Pottle were deep in conversation, their voices low but not quite low enough to escape Miss Marple's sharp hearing. "I saw someone at Geraldine's window 2 nights before it happened," Dora Lytton whispered, stirring her tea absently. A man, at least I think it was a man. Tall coat collar turned up. Just standing there. Miss Marple's teacup paused mid-air, her thoughts racing. A man at the window. Unexpected. Alarming. She tucked the detail away, as one might slip a folded note into a secret pocket. The Reverend exhaled sharply, his voice tight with restraint. "Why didn't you say anything? I thought it might have been a tradesman, or perhaps a suitor." Geraldine was a private woman, Dora murmured, her eyes darting around the room nervously. The Reverend shook his head. "It's of no use now. The doctors signed it off. Natural causes. Poor woman. Perhaps stress brought it on." Miss Lytton shook her head, her voice suddenly stronger. No, I don't think it was just stress. I think she was afraid." The room fell silent for a beat, the weight of her words settling between them like a stone dropped into water. When Miss Marple's cup was lowered, her expression had shifted, sharper, as if a piece of the puzzle had just slid into place. She knew then that the threads of fear, suspicion and silence were all tangled up together, and something much darker lay beneath the surface of this sleepy village. As the day wore on, she visited the church hall under the pretext of checking the inventory for the postponed exhibition. But there, amidst the dusty old boxes and quiet corners, the air seemed heavy with something more than just the dust of forgotten things. There was a secret waiting to be uncovered, and Miss Marple was more than ready to unravel it, stitch by stitch. Fernwood, with its quiet charm and unassuming pace, was a village that kept its secrets well hidden beneath the surface, like delicate threads woven into a tapestry that only the keenest eyes could decipher. Miss Marple, in her unassuming way, had always known this. She understood that the smallest details, often overlooked, were the ones that could unravel the greatest mysteries. It was on a soft blue evening, as the fading light turned the world outside her window into a hazy blur, that Miss Marple sat, hands folded over a half-finished cross-stitch, staring at the work in front of her. The motif she was embroidering, a simple ivy leaf, moved beneath her fingers in rhythmic precision, but her thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in the snags of the case she had come to occupy her mind. Geraldine's unfinished sampler, the mysterious name Marjorie, stitched into its border, still lingered in her thoughts. Geraldine, always so precise in her work, had left it incomplete, a single thread dangling where a final knot should have been tied. Why had she left it unfinished? And more troubling still, why had she stitched a name into her sampler that no one in Fernwood seemed to recognize? These questions gnawed at Miss Marple, each one pulling at the delicate fabric of the mystery, making it ever more complex, ever more intriguing. The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more the strange occurrences seemed to connect in ways that were too deliberate to be mere coincidence. The man at the window, someone had seen him, a shadowy figure standing outside Geraldine's house 2 nights before her death, watching her through the glass. Why had he been there? Was he simply a passerby, or had he been waiting for something? The fact that the police had deemed Geraldine's death a case of natural causes, a sudden stroke perhaps brought on by stress, left Miss Marple deeply unsatisfied. There were too many unanswered questions. The unfinished sampler, the stranger at the window, the name stitched into the fabric, everything was pointing to something darker than a simple health issue. But what was it? Who was the man? And why had Geraldine been so secretive about her work? Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was buried just beneath the surface, and it was her job to stitch it together, one piece at a time. The next morning, the village was buzzing with talk, the air thick with gossip, and Miss Marple could feel the weight of suspicion hanging in the air like a heavy fog. The whispers were swift and unforgiving, as people pointed fingers at Colin Trent, the young handyman who had been seen around Geraldine's house just days before her death. They said Geraldine had invited him over to fix her gate, but he never left. The very idea of it, the image of Colin, awkward and red-faced, lingering near Geraldine's house, felt like another puzzle piece sliding into place. But Miss Marple knew that appearances were often deceiving, and the truth was rarely so neatly packaged. Gossip had a way of weaving itself into a story, making it fit what people wanted to believe. As Miss Marple passed by the bakery later that morning, she overheard more of the scandalous chatter. Mrs. Dora Lytton was gossiping with the butcher's niece, Elsie Carter, both of them eagerly clutching their baskets, as they exchanged words about Colin Trent's supposed involvement in Geraldine's death. "They say Geraldine had him fix her gate," Elsie whispered. "And he never left." Mrs. Lytton gasped as if the very idea was too scandalous to consider. "He's barely 20, she said, as though his youth was a shield against any wrongdoing. But Miss Marple wasn't so easily convinced. She tucked the name away in her mind. Colin Trent, the young handyman with the slightly flushed cheeks, the one who was often seen carting tools around the village, the one who had been at Geraldine's house just days before her death. Could he be the man they were all so quick to blame? Or was he merely another victim of the village's insatiable need for an explanation, for a scapegoat? By the time afternoon rolled around, Constable Reeves had made his appearance, striding purposefully toward the Fox cottage, his notebook fluttering in the wind, pencil at the ready. To anyone else it might have seemed like a legitimate investigation, but Miss Marple knew better. The constable's actions were more for show than substance, a performance for the villagers who wanted to believe that justice was being done. When Miss Marple passed by, she nodded politely, offering no comment but noting his nervous formality. "Just tying up a few things," he said with a forced smile. But Miss Marple could see through it. There was no real investigation here, just a man going through the motions. He mentioned Colin Trent in passing, a casual remark, as though he had already made up his mind. "We've spoken to him," the constable said. "Nothing formal, just a chat." But Miss Marple knew the gate had never been fixed, the latch left undone as if it had been deliberately ignored. It was a small thing, a detail that most would have overlooked, but for Miss Marple it was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Later that evening, as the village settled into a hush and the last of the gossip faded into the shadows, Miss Marple sat once again in her favorite chair, the cross-stitching forgotten in her hands, as her mind traced the threads of the case. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that every stitch, every conversation, every tiny detail, was leading her towards something much darker than anyone had yet suspected. There was a hidden pattern here, one that only she could see, a pattern of secrecy, of half-truths, and of a death that was anything but natural. The name Marjorie, on Geraldine's sampler, the man at the window, the incomplete work, these weren't random details. They were pieces of a story that was waiting to be revealed, thread by thread, as soon as Miss Marple could weave the final connections together. The weight of Fernwood's secrets hung heavy in the damp air, as if the village itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to break. 3 days had passed since Geraldine Fox's death had been attributed to natural causes, and yet the air felt thick with unresolved tension. The villagers, ever eager to settle on something, anything, had quickly latched onto the most convenient suspect, Colin Trent, the young handyman, whose temper had been noted as volatile. A few whispered words from Mrs. Lytton and a stray comment from the baker's wife had solidified his place in the center of the scandal. But Miss Marple knew better. She had seen this pattern before, the way suspicion could be woven with half-truths, until it became an impenetrable tapestry of guilt. As she walked through the village that afternoon, her mind was a quiet storm of thoughts, each one circling back to the same point. Geraldine had not died of a stroke, as the doctors suggested. There was something more, something darker, and Miss Marple could feel it in the very air around her. She passed Colin Trent's allotment garden, finding him there, kneeling by his turnips, his hands stained with dirt, his brow furrowed with worry. He looked up in surprise as she approached. "Miss Marple," he stammered, brushing dirt off his trousers, a hint of unease in his voice. "Didn't expect company." "I'm not company," Miss Marple replied, her tone as gentle as ever. "I'm merely walking, enjoying the fine weather." She glanced down at the cracked watering can in his hands, the patched tin sides, an improvisation that spoke volumes. "I hear you had a disagreement with Geraldine," she said, watching him closely. His face tightened. "Yes," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "She was a difficult woman, always changing her mind, never satisfied, but I never wanted her dead. I didn't. His words trailed off, his gaze distant, and Miss Marple could see the vulnerability in his eyes. Did she pay you for the work? She asked, her tone soft but insistent. No, Colin replied, shaking his head. Said the latch wasn't to her liking, that it needed a more delicate touch. She said I didn't have the right hands for the job. Miss Marple's eyes flickered as she processed his words. Did you return after that? She asked. No, he answered quickly. I thought she'd cooled off. I never saw her again. But did anyone else visit her, Mr. Trent? Miss Marple pressed, her gaze steady. He hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. Reverend Pottle, he said quietly. I saw him leaving her gate just before she died. It was late, an odd hour. The mention of the Reverend's name sent a ripple through Miss Marple, but she kept her expression neutral. Thank you, Mr. Trent, she said softly. You've been most helpful. Later that evening, the flickering light from the vicarage window revealed Reverend Pottle seated beside Mrs. Beanton and Dora Lytton, all three sipping elderflower cordial, the fire casting long shadows over their faces. Miss Marple entered quietly, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Ah, Miss Marple. The Reverend greeted her, his voice tinged with wounded dignity. What brings you here this evening? I was just wondering, Miss Marple said, her voice calm but sharp. About your visit to Geraldine Fox. I hear it was a pastoral call. You visited her late in the evening, did you not? The Reverend blinked momentarily, caught off guard. Yes, he said slowly, his gaze shifting toward the window. She needed counsel, spiritual guidance. She was troubled. And did she mention the name Marjorie? Miss Marple asked, her tone casual but pointed. Marjorie. The Reverend's face froze for a moment before he carefully masked it with a look of polite indifference. No, he said, his voice tight. The name means nothing to me. But Miss Marple noticed the way his thumb pressed into the arm of the chair, the knuckle turning white as he tried to keep his composure. Outside, the darkness seemed to press in closer, as if the night itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple left them to their cordial, her mind a whirl of questions that refused to settle. Geraldine's death was no accident. Colin Trent, with his angry outbursts, was an easy suspect. But Miss Marple had seen enough to know that things were rarely as they seemed. There was another player in this game. Someone older, quieter, someone who moved through the shadows, stitching their alibi together long before the first suspicion had even been cast. As she walked home in the chill of the evening, the village around her felt unnervingly still. But Miss Marple knew better. Suspicion was not a fleeting thing here. It was a shadow, growing longer with every passing day. She had only to follow it to its source, and the truth would reveal itself. It always did in time. But for now the pieces remained scattered, just out of reach, and Miss Marple knew it would take every ounce of her careful attention to bring them together. Miss Marple, with her sharp eye for human nature, knew better than anyone that mysteries often hide in the quietest, most subtle details. Those small, seemingly inconsequential things that others brush aside. So when she arrived at the church on that crisp afternoon, ostensibly to drop off a basket of tinned peaches for the upcoming parish picnic, her true purpose lay elsewhere. As she entered the church's vestry, her gaze immediately swept over the familiar surroundings. But it was not the tinned goods or the list of parishioners' names that held her attention. It was something far more elusive, something out of place, a forgotten object, nestled behind a stack of hymnals in a dusty side cupboard, something half-wrapped in cloth that instantly caught her eye. Most would have thought it was just another abandoned piece of work, but Miss Marple, who had observed far more revealing clues over the years, knew better. With a slight frown, she uncovered a wooden embroidery frame. Geraldine Fox's initials were etched into it, faint but unmistakable. G.F. Her pulse quickened ever so slightly, the familiar, quiet thrill of a mystery at hand surging through her. This was no accident, no random artifact. This was a message waiting to be understood. Carefully, Miss Marple peeled away the cloth wrapping, revealing the sampler beneath it. It was small, far smaller than the one intended for the quilting exhibition, but just as intricately crafted. A scene of a peaceful garden, with lavender in bloom, a beehive in the corner, and a graceful willow tree shading a little bench. But then in the bottom corner, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught something that made her blood run cold. A delicate line of stitched words. To Marjorie. Gone but not forgiven. There was no mistaking the bitterness embedded in those words. A sharp contrast to the tranquil scene above. This was no dedication of affection or love, but of unresolved, festering hatred. Gone but not forgiven. The message seemed to pulse with a deep, unspoken anger. That evening, Miss Marple had tea with Mrs. Dora Lytton, under the pretense of checking on her sore ankle. She had always found Dora to be an interesting person, kind-hearted, but like so many in Fernwood, holding tightly to old stories and village secrets. The conversation, as it inevitably did, turned to Geraldine Fox, whose sudden and mysterious death still weighed heavily on the village. Miss Marple stirred a thin slice of lemon into her tea, her voice casual but probing as she mentioned Geraldine's pride in her embroidery. "Do you remember if she ever mentioned a Marjorie?" Miss Marple asked, watching Dora carefully. For a moment Dora's spoon paused mid-air, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Marjorie? Good heavens, that name hasn't come up in years. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's gaze softened. "I came across it," she said simply, "stitched into one of Geraldine's earlier pieces." Dora sat back in her chair, her eyes flicking toward the window for a moment, as though the memory were a sudden, unwelcome guest. "Oh yes," she replied slowly. "They were close once. Best friends, I think. But that ended badly. It was about some inheritance, or a misunderstanding over money. Nothing in writing, of course. But it was enough to drive a wedge between them." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her tone quiet but intent. "So they never made amends?" Dora sighed, a long weary breath. "No, Marjorie left. Went to Scotland, I think. Some said she tried to write, to make peace, but Geraldine wouldn't even open the letters. In fact, I remember one time, Geraldine burned the letter in the garden stove, without even reading it. Quite dramatic, really." The words hung in the air for a moment before Miss Marple asked, as innocently as she could, "Do you think Geraldine ever regretted that?" But Dora, looking uncomfortable, waved her hand dismissively. "Who can say? All I know is that it was a long time ago, and Geraldine had her own pride. A little too much, if you ask me." The conversation wound down, but Miss Marple's mind was already racing, the puzzle pieces beginning to fall into place. The next morning, she returned to the Fox cottage, a place now steeped in the quiet echo of recent tragedy. The constable, now less wary of her, gave a brief distracted nod of acknowledgement, grateful for the jar of elderberry jam she had left him. Inside, the cottage smelled faintly of lavender sachets and dust, the remnants of a life once vibrant, but now tainted with sorrow. Miss Marple's sharp eyes immediately found the embroidery hoop still resting on the side table. The red thread had been cut clean, not snapped, but cut with deliberate precision. An unfinished border, a symbol of something left incomplete, unfinished. Yet it wasn't just the sampler that caught her attention. It was the waste paper bin beneath the table, scrupulously empty, save for one small scrap of paper. Miss Marple knelt, her fingers brushing against the cool wood of the floorboards, and retrieved the scrap. It was a small scorched piece, the edges curled as though burned in haste. One word was barely legible, a signature. Gary. Her mind clicked. Gary. The same name that had surfaced from her quiet, unassuming observation. Miss Marple folded the paper carefully, tucking it into her sleeve as she stood, her mind already spinning with the implications. The threads of the mystery were tightening, not around the obvious suspects, but around the quiet, unseen movements of someone who knew how to weave their own alibi carefully, long before the first red thread of suspicion ever snapped. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of rose-hip tea, her eyes distant as her mind sifted through the intricate details of the mystery. Every piece of the puzzle was slowly coming together, each one more tightly wound than the last. It was like staring at a fractured painting, one where the colors seem nonsensical until the right brushstroke is made, and suddenly, everything is illuminated. Geraldine Fox had received another letter, one she had angrily burned. Its words, once scolding, now disappeared in the flames. But that was only part of the story. The true revelation came with the sampler. A personal artifact she'd stitched with such bitterness, her emotions woven into each thread. But why had she hidden that sampler away in the vestry cupboard? Who had moved it there? And more importantly, who had made sure it vanished just as she did? Miss Marple's thoughts raced as she pieced the clues together. The answer was not in the flames, nor the sampler itself, but in the one person who had the most to gain by erasing Marjorie's memory forever, by ensuring it turned to ash and smoke. As she looked out the window, her gaze falling on the vicarage across the green, she couldn't shake the question that had been gnawing at her. Why had Reverend Pottle denied ever knowing Marjorie's name? The morning that followed brought a steady, unyielding rain, a soft drizzle that seemed to seep into everything it touched. It wasn't just the weather that darkened Fernwood. There was a palpable tension in the air, thick and suffocating, like an impending storm. The villagers moved about, going through their routines, but there was an undercurrent of something unspoken, something lurking beneath the surface. Miss Marple, unfazed by the rain, made her way to the parish library, her umbrella shielding her from the droplets. She wasn't interested in the books today. It was the people she needed to observe, the conversations that would reveal what had been carefully hidden. Inside, Mrs. Edith Bington was fussing with the gardening almanac, its pages worn with use, while Miss Dora Lytton sat by the window, the well-thumbed copy of Persuasion in her hands. But she hadn't turned a page in what felt like hours. Such dreadful weather, Mrs. Bington muttered theatrically, her tone almost as though she were performing for an unseen audience. As if the sky knows what has happened. Miss Marple, ever composed, removed her gloves slowly, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Bington's. Rain has a way of uncovering things, loosening roots, washing over paths we thought were dry, she replied, her voice smooth, deliberate. Dora's eyes flickered up, sensing the hidden meaning in Miss Marple's words. That sounds almost deliberate, she said, her curiosity piqued. Miss Marple's lips curved into the faintest smile. Sometimes nature is deliberate. Sometimes people are too. It didn't take long for the conversation to return to Geraldine. Though this time, the tone had shifted. It was no longer casual speculation but a murmur of suspicion. I've been thinking about that sampler, Mrs. Bington said, her voice lower now, as though sharing a secret she hadn't quite intended to. You remember she was making it for the exhibition but never showed anyone. Well, she always kept to herself about it, as if she were hiding something. Dora nodded thoughtfully, her brow furrowed. I noticed she'd been acting strangely lately, jumpy, not like herself at all. And she told me she saw someone in her garden late at night. Edith whispered to me once, just before she passed, that she thought someone had come to ask for forgiveness. Dora leaned forward, her voice dropping. She told me the same thing. But she was afraid. Afraid of what, I wonder? Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but it held a weight of understanding. Afraid? She asked softly. Edith nodded, her expression grim. She said she'd made mistakes, things people don't easily forgive. And then she asked me something strange. She wanted to know if I thought people could change, truly change. If someone could regret a grudge they'd been holding for far too long. Dora's eyes widened slightly. She asked me that too. And then she said something even stranger. It's going to end soon either way. At first I thought she meant her sampler. But now, I wonder if it was something else. Miss Marple sat back, her mind racing, each detail falling into place like an intricate dance of shadows and light. What had Geraldine been preparing for? What had she known that made her believe the past was coming for her, demanding its reckoning? By the time afternoon arrived, Miss Marple paid a visit to the church. She was met by the sight of Reverend Pottle, seated at his desk, his hands folded in silent prayer, eyes heavy with fatigue. The pile of unsorted hymnals beside him was a clear sign of a mind distracted, overwhelmed perhaps by something far beyond mere paperwork. When he looked up and saw her, his face tensed, his voice strained. Miss Marple, he greeted, his tone sharp. Come to offer more thoughts on embroidery, perhaps? Miss Marple allowed a small knowing smile to curl at the corner of her lips. Actually, I came to ask about your vestry cupboard, she said, her voice calm but probing. Do you monitor who places items there? The change in the Reverend's expression was immediate. His guarded response told her everything she needed to know. There was something he was hiding, something he didn't want her to uncover. It's not locked, he said, his voice careful, but the key is kept behind the pulpit. Why do you ask? Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, her mind already threading together the clues she had gathered. There was something in the way he had reacted, something in the way he had skirted the question. The key to the mystery, she now realized, lay within the very walls of the church. And it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. Miss Marple sat in the quiet of her sitting room, the delicate evening light barely filtering through the half-drawn curtains, casting long shadows across the room. The letter, now safely tucked beneath her shawl, weighed heavily in her hands. Its crinkled edges were a testament to the years it had spent hidden away, and yet, the ink remained legible, albeit faint. The words, simple at first glance, were charged with an undeniable sense of urgency, as if each sentence carried the weight of years of untold secrets. Geraldine, if you've read this, I thank you. The sentence lingered in her thoughts, echoing through the room. It was a message of regret, a quiet admission of something lost between the lines, but it carried more than just sorrow. It carried the kind of truth that one would bury deep, refusing to acknowledge, yet unable to forget. Why had Colin, the reclusive, almost invisible man of Fernwood, gone to such great lengths to preserve this letter, to hide it in the most unlikely of places? And why had he kept it from the authorities, from Miss Marple herself, who had been quietly following the threads of this tangled mystery? As soon as she had discovered the small envelope wrapped in oilskin, buried beneath the damp soil of Colin's garden, something deep within her had shifted. There was too much deliberation, too much care in how it had been concealed. Colin had taken extreme measures to ensure it remained hidden. Was it to protect someone, or to protect the truth itself? Her mind flickered to Reverend Pottle, who had collapsed the morning after their brief conversation. His pallor had not been just a result of exhaustion, as the doctor claimed. No, it was something deeper, a weight that had settled heavily on his heart. The Reverend's strained words, his refusal to acknowledge the name Marjorie, only deepened her suspicion. The village doctor had diagnosed it as a stress-induced episode, likely from the grief of Geraldine's sudden death, and the shock of Colin's disappearance. But Miss Marple could feel it. This was more than just exhaustion. Pottle was hiding something, something that tied him to the past, something that linked him to the lost years of the village's darkest secrets. Miss Marple's thoughts turned back to the letter. The quiet, almost desperate tone of Marjorie's words haunted her. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a threat. It was a plea. If you ever find it in your heart to write back, I will wait. The plea was simple, yet it spoke volumes. Two women, both carrying the weight of their pasts, both trapped by their shared history. A history Miss Marple now knew was riddled with betrayal, guilt, and regret. Geraldine's softening, her willingness to forgive after all those years of silence, had terrified someone. But who? And why had they gone to such lengths to bury the truth, to prevent it from resurfacing? As Miss Marple stood in the dim light of her sitting room, the letter folded carefully in her pocket, she felt the threads of the mystery tightening around her. Colin had vanished, as if swallowed by the earth itself, and yet the remnants of his actions were scattered in his wake. He had been the last to see Reverend Pottle, and perhaps the last to know the full extent of the tangled past that connected them all. Mrs. Bington's gossip about the Reverend's condition, her insinuations about his guilt, only added fuel to the fire of Miss Marple's suspicions. He's guilty, mark my words, Mrs. Bington had said. But Miss Marple didn't believe it was that simple. No, the Reverend's guilt was much deeper than the gossip that swirled around him. The truth was tied to the past, a past that had long been forgotten by everyone but a select few. Why had Colin hidden the letter, and not shared it with anyone. What was it that had made him so desperate to keep it from the world? And why had he chosen to bury it in his garden, a place where the earth could keep it safe, where no one would think to look? The village buzzed with unease, with whispers of guilt and suspicion. The missing Colin, the dying Reverend, the mysteries surrounding Geraldine's death. They were all interconnected. The small, unassuming village of Fernwood, which had once felt so peaceful, was now a place where secrets could no longer remain hidden. As Miss Marple stood up and moved toward the door, her mind was sharp, focused on the task at hand. She knew the threads were beginning to unravel. She had already pulled one, and now the rest would follow. Someone had gone to great lengths to bury the truth, to keep the past from surfacing. But Miss Marple knew better. In Fernwood, the past had a way of coming back to life when it was least expected. Each thread, each piece of the puzzle, would eventually be revealed. And when it was, the truth would be more dangerous than anyone could have anticipated. Fox Cottage stood eerily silent, its windows dark and unmoving beneath the shadow of evening. For weeks it had remained uninhabited, save for the constable's rare visits. But now something felt different, as if the house itself was hiding a secret, one it could no longer keep. As Miss Marple approached, her gaze naturally shifted to the back window, where the curtain, usually drawn with such care, had been hastily pulled across. Behind it, the familiar sight of the embroidery frame sat on the parlor table, but there was something off about it. The frame was positioned awkwardly, as though someone had quickly abandoned their task, leaving it in a state of disarray. This wasn't right, she thought, her instincts telling her something was amiss. She circled the garden path, careful not to disturb the neatly tended flower beds. The earth near the rear gate was freshly disturbed, not in the manner of careless gardening, but as if someone had been trying to hide something. Kneeling, she brushed the soil away, her fingers lightly touching the damp earth. And there, partially buried, was a broken tea saucer, its edges chipped and worn. At first glance, it seemed insignificant, a simple fragment of porcelain. Yet the pale blue forget-me-not pattern stirred something in her memory. Geraldine had owned a set of these. She had used them during every quilting meeting Miss Marple had hosted. Holding up the shard, Miss Marple noticed something else. Residue clinging to the underside, faint but unmistakably greasy. It wasn't tea. It was something chemical, something more sinister. That evening, Miss Marple invited Dora Lytton and Edith Bington for tea, a quiet, deliberate gathering. She served lemon biscuits, and poured strong Earl Grey. But there was no mention of the letter, the grave, or the disturbing discovery at Fox Cottage. Instead, Miss Marple casually began a conversation, one that seemed to float in the air with the weight of unspoken truths. "Do you remember," she asked, her tone light, "when Geraldine first joined the quilting circle?" Dora blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Oh yes, it must have been about 5 years ago. She came back from London after her mother passed. Always insisted she preferred solitude," she added, her voice a little softer. "But she warmed to us eventually. I think she liked being the expert." Edith chimed in. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her fingers wrapped around the teacup. "She once told me," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "that her only regret in life was misjudging someone she cared about, that it had cost her more than she ever admitted." Neither woman responded. The silence between them was heavy, but Miss Marple pressed on. "She never said who," she added, setting the teapot down with deliberate calmness. "But it strikes me now. Perhaps she meant Marjorie." The mention of the name sent a subtle ripple through the room. Edith's gaze shifted uncomfortably, and Dora cleared her throat, the air suddenly thick with unease. "Well, that's in the past, isn't it? Nothing good ever comes from digging too deep," Edith murmured, as if trying to dismiss the conversation. But Miss Marple, undeterred, met her eyes with quiet resolve. "Sometimes," she said softly, "it uncovers the truth." Later that evening, as darkness draped over Fernwood, the sound of a shout shattered the stillness. A young stable boy, passing by the church path, had stumbled upon a figure collapsed at the edge of the woods, near the vicarage. It was Colin Trent, alive, but dazed, with blood trickling from a wound on his temple. Someone had struck him, meant to leave him there, forgotten. A rock lay near his head, slick with rain, and stained with something darker. In his pocket, a crumpled note was found, torn at the corner, but still legible. "You should have burned it." Constable Reeves arrived in a flurry, flustered and inept, while Miss Marple appeared soon after, calm and composed, her mind already racing with the implications. This was no longer just about Geraldine's death. This was about a secret someone had tried twice to bury, once with thread, and once with blood. Colin Trent remained unconscious, his condition stable but serious. He had not spoken since the doctor treated his wound, his eyes still clouded by confusion. He lay propped up on a narrow bed in the vicarage infirmary, an arrangement Miss Marple found quietly ironic. The Reverend had insisted that Colin recover there, closer to God, he'd said, though Miss Marple couldn't help but feel that there was more to it. Closer to something else entirely. She mused silently, but she said nothing. Not yet. She waited until evening, when the doctor had gone, and Constable Reeves had returned to his rounds, before entering the infirmary. A tray in hand she approached Colin, her every movement deliberate. There was no rush, not yet. She set the tray on the table beside him, its contents warm and comforting, but her mind remained sharp and focused. There were pieces of the puzzle still scattered across Fernwood, pieces that once connected, would reveal a truth far darker than any of them had imagined. Miss Marple sat by the small window of the vicarage, the daylight filtering through, casting faint shadows on the walls, as she stirred her tea thoughtfully. In front of her, Colin Trent sat, his gaze distant, his eyes bloodshot from a restless night. The bandage around his temple was still fresh, his body bruised and weary, but his mind was sharp, painfully aware of the weight of the secrets he had tried to bury. He flinched slightly as she set a plate of soft bread and a slice of jam on the table in front of him. "Comfort food," she said, her voice gentle but firm, like a long-ago lesson in patience. "Not fancy, but reliable. Just like the truth." Colin didn't respond at first, his fingers tracing the edge of his teacup, lost in thought. The silence stretched thick and uncomfortable. "I didn't run away," he finally said, his voice rough, eyes not meeting hers. "I just buried something." "A letter?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "The one from Marjorie to Geraldine?" she asked quietly. Colin nodded, his throat tight. "I thought if I kept it, maybe it would help someone understand. Or help her." His voice trailed off, haunted. Miss Marple looked at him steadily, her mind already piecing together the fragments of a far darker puzzle than even he could see. "You thought it mattered more than it seemed. But you never told anyone, did you?" Colin shook his head, swallowing hard. "I thought if I kept it hidden, it wouldn't hurt anyone more." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "You did what you thought best. But someone else has been trying to bury more than letters." She paused, leaning forward. "Have you heard about the tea saucer, the one found in Geraldine's garden?" Colin tensed, his hands clenched at his sides. "I didn't know about it," he whispered, his voice strained. "I swear." Miss Marple studied him carefully, seeing something beneath the surface. "Fear, yes, but something else too. Perhaps," she said slowly, "someone else tried to erase not just words, but memories too." The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken implications. Later that day, Miss Marple found herself walking through the familiar church hall, now bustling with anxious energy as preparations for the quilt exhibition resumed. She noted the hurried pace, the nervous energy, the unfinished work that seemed to hum with a sense of impending revelation. Mrs. Edith Bington, ever meticulous, was carefully adjusting the tablecloths, smoothing them down with military precision. Miss Marple's footsteps were soft, deliberate, as she approached. "Have you ever tried to unpick a stitch that's been left too long?" she asked, her voice casual, as if discussing a minor detail. Edith looked up, startled, Pardon. Miss Marple smiled faintly, pointing to the delicate embroidery. In needlework, the longer you leave a mistake, the harder it becomes to fix. It frays, unravels, sometimes ruining the entire pattern. Edith paused, her fingers stilling on the cloth. I suppose so, she replied coolly. That's why I finish my pieces properly. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze flicking to the pristine edges of the tablecloth. Yes, you always had a talent for neatness. She didn't wait for Edith to respond, but instead, her thoughts turned to Geraldine's work, her meticulous, careful stitching, even when she had been angry. Geraldine's stitching, Miss Marple said softly, was never rushed, even when she was embroidering unpleasant things. Like the sampler to Marjorie. Edith's hands froze, the air around them charged with a sudden tension. I didn't know what you meant, Miss Marple continued gently. But I suspect you did. The silence was thick now, almost suffocating. You were the one who wrote to her. Miss Marple pressed, urged her not to come back. Why? Edith's voice was low, almost flat. She was going to ruin everything. There was an edge to her words, a bitterness that twisted the air between them. She'd started writing again. Geraldine burned the first letter, but Colin found it. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. You struck him, she said softly, her voice even. I thought he'd go to the papers. Or worse, show the sampler, Edith said, her voice a mixture of regret and cold calculation. And Geraldine? Miss Marple asked. What did she plan to do? Edith's eyes flared with contempt. She said she was considering reconciliation. Can you imagine? The words hung in the air, filled with raw unspoken history. After all those years, that woman could just walk back in. Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. She simply turned away, leaving Edith to stew in her own guilt. Later she requested a quiet tea with Reverend Pottles, hoping for a moment of peace, but more, hoping to hear the truth behind his calm exterior. I was hoping, she said pleasantly, you might help me recreate something. He blinked a little confused. Recreate? He asked, his voice cautious. Yes, she said. Geraldine's last tea. She served lemon sponge, didn't she? And that forget-me-not china, the blue pattern. The Reverend's face stiffened, his eyes narrowing. She made it herself, he said, his voice low. It was a set from her mother. She never used it for guests, only for special occasions. Miss Marple smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Ah, she said. But someone broke a saucer, Reverend. Someone who wasn't meant to be there. The Reverend froze, his face paling as the realization of Miss Marple's words began to sink in. The pieces were coming together now, and the mystery was deeper than any of them had imagined. Geraldine's death was no longer just a tragedy. It was the key to a secret someone had desperately tried to bury. The evening descended quietly on Fernwood as Miss Marple sat at her table, contemplating the intricate web she had spun. The secrets surrounding Geraldine's death seemed to tighten like a noose, every thread pulled further into the abyss of betrayal. The room hummed with tension, the scent of tea filling the air, but it was the silence that weighed heavily on those gathered. Mrs. Bington, with her impeccable attention to detail, had arrived, but it was her own stifled unease that betrayed the truth. She wasn't just here for tea. She was here to keep a lid on what had been buried beneath the polite veneer of Fernwood society. As Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the room, she noticed the faint tremor in Colin Trent's hands, the young man who had once been too proud to notice the simmering darkness around him, but now carried its weight. There was something in his gaze, haunted yet calculating, that told Miss Marple he knew more than he let on. It was as if the very air around them had been thickened by all that was left unsaid, the unspoken tension clinging to the walls like dust. A letter, hidden away, a sampler stitched in haste, a broken china saucer, each fragment whispered of secrets that could no longer stay buried. The truth, Miss Marple mused softly, her voice cutting through the thick silence, always finds a way to surface, no matter how deeply it is buried. She knew someone in this room was guilty, but the question was who, and why. She had observed their every movement, noted every glance, every slight tremor of discomfort. The invitation had been simple enough, yet its purpose had been far more intricate. This wasn't just tea. It was a carefully orchestrated gathering, a stage for the truth to be revealed. The facade of civility was thin, and Miss Marple intended to peel it away, thread by thread, until the sordid truth was exposed. Each guest was a piece of the puzzle, and she had already begun to see the edges forming. Edith's impeccable precision, Dora's unassuming presence, the Reverend's hidden guilt, all of it pointed to something darker, deeper. Miss Marple had already set the trap, and now all that was left was for them to fall into it. The door creaked open once more, and there stood Annie Pratt, as unpredictable as ever, clutching her rhubarb tart, and a knowing smile. She wasn't invited, but she didn't need permission. She was part of Fernwood's undercurrent, the whisper that would carry the truth to places it couldn't be ignored. As she placed her tart on the table with exaggerated care, Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Not everyone in this room would leave with their secrets intact. The clock ticked on, its rhythmic sound echoing the steady unraveling of a carefully spun lie. And when the truth finally surfaced, it would be as sharp and unforgiving as the needle that had stitched Geraldine's final unfinished sampler. Miss Marple rose slowly, her eyes sweeping across the room with a quiet, piercing intensity that unsettled the very air. Colin was attacked, not killed, she began, her voice calm yet filled with an undercurrent of certainty that made everyone stiffen. He was frightened, not because of some outside threat, but because someone thought he knew too much. He knew about Marjorie, about Geraldine's plans to forgive, and that, I believe, was the true threat. Forgiveness, she added softly, her gaze fixed on Edith, was what threatened you most, wasn't it? Every eye in the room snapped to Mrs. Bington, whose stillness seemed unnatural, as though she were holding her breath beneath the weight of Miss Marple's words. Edith sat rigid, her hands clutching her knees, knuckles as white as the bones of some forgotten secret. She betrayed my trust, Edith spoke at last, her voice almost a whisper. My mother cared for hers in her final days. We gave everything, time, dignity, while she schemed to rewrite her will and cut Marjorie back into it. A bitter laugh escaped her, thin and cruel. She never amended it, Miss Marple said simply. Edith's eyes flashed, fury rising. No, but she planned to, she hissed, leaning forward. Geraldine knew, and she let it happen, all the while playing the martyr. Then she waltzed back into this village, with her smug face and perfect stitching, wearing her half-hearted regrets like a crown. But I knew she was a fool. Miss Marple's voice was steady, measured, and when she told you she had stitched Marjorie's name into the sampler, Edith's face twisted with revulsion. I begged her to reconsider, she spat. I told her she was a fool. She wouldn't listen. She said she was tired of holding grudges. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And that's when you decided to act, didn't you? When you slipped something into her tea. A long pause followed. Edith's gaze dropped to the floor, her silence speaking volumes. It wasn't poison. Not really. Just enough to still her heart, she admitted softly. She was always delicate. The doctor said it wouldn't take much. The room seemed to hold its breath as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. And then you broke the saucer in your panic. The forget-me-not china, Miss Marple continued. You tidied it all away, left the door ajar, and moved the sampler to the church. You thought it would be forgotten there, but it wasn't, was it? Edith murmured. I just wanted it gone. That name, that stitch, that forgiveness. Reverend Pottle, sitting quietly, his eyes closed, seemed to withdraw deeper into himself. Miss Marple poured the final cup of tea, her hands steady, unfazed by the revelations. We cannot erase what has been done, Edith, but we can acknowledge it. Her voice was gentle now, but there was an unspoken finality in her words. Geraldine tried. In the end she reached for grace. Colin stirred in his seat, but did not speak. His silence said all that needed to be said. Edith's gaze lingered for a moment longer, But no more words came from her lips. The weight of the truth hung in the air, suffocating. An hour later, Constable Reeves arrived, his presence breaking the stillness that had settled over the room. Edith did not protest. She left quietly, her eyes hollow, her silence louder than any words could ever be. As the evening drew on, Miss Marple stood by her window, the sun dipping low behind the hedge. Fernwood would soon return to its peaceful, deceptively quiet rhythm. But the threads that had been torn would never mend completely. Some patterns were too altered to fix, and some forgiveness came too late to undo the damage that pride had inflicted. The next morning, the village woke to a strange hush, the kind that only Fernwood knew how to breed. Word of Edith's confession hadn't yet spread officially, but Fernwood always knew before the rest of the world did. At the vicarage, Reverend Pottle's voice was thick with the residue of guilt as he recited the morning prayers. At the grocer's, Dora Lytton lingered near the jam shelves, eyes downcast, waiting for a prompt to speak. The usual morning chatter at the tea shop had faded into nervous glances, the clink of teaspoons, the only sound breaking the silence. And yet, in her cottage, Miss Marple remained unchanged. The embroidery in her lap was unfinished, but she had something else to complete now, something far more intricate than threads and fabric. Constable Reeves had asked her to recount the details for the record. He was clearly troubled by how he had missed the obvious, how a simple red thread had led him astray. But Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, began her recounting, not with Geraldine's death, but with the subtle unraveling of all the secrets Fernwood had buried beneath its surface. Miss Marple stood by the window, her sharp eyes watching the village slowly return to its routine. But beneath the surface, things were far from settled. The air was thick with unspoken words and unseen tensions, much like the tangled threads of a quilt waiting to be untangled. The story had started long before the poison, long before the quiet deceit of a sampler stitched with more than just thread. It began with a choice that would set everything into motion. Geraldine had wanted to mend what had been broken. She had decided to forgive, to heal a wound that had festered for years between her and Marjorie. The sampler, innocuous to most, was her attempt to make peace, her name entwined in the delicate stitches, a symbol of reconciliation. But Geraldine had been too naive, too hopeful. She did not understand the depth of Edith's bitterness, the weight of old wounds that never healed, and the fury they could provoke. Edith could not bear the thought of Geraldine turning the page, of letting the past be buried, and so she did what anyone desperate to hold on to their pride would do. She silenced it, quietly and carefully. It wasn't poison, not the kind you could taste or see, but it was enough to still a heart already fragile from years of regret. Geraldine had slumped over, her body a final surrender to the strain of her own attempt at forgiveness. In her haste, Edith broke the saucer, the sound sharp and final, echoing in the silence of that fateful night. She hid the sampler, as if that simple act could erase the truth it carried, and left the door ajar, hoping the world would never know. But the world always knows, in its own way. Colin, with his quiet curiosity, had found the letter, the unopened letter from Marjorie. He didn't know its significance, but he felt its weight, and when Edith realized he had it, she couldn't bear it. The truth was slipping from her fingers, and she would do anything to keep it from coming to light. She followed him, a threat in her eyes, a warning in her grip. Fear had made her reckless, and the strike meant to intimidate had gone too far. She had silenced him too, though it wasn't death she had sought, only silence. But silence has a way of amplifying everything, of making small actions echo in ways you never expected. The Reverend, lost in his own cowardice, had found the sampler, the red thread, and instead of confronting the mess, he had hidden it, as if that could undo the damage. He knew more than he let on, but not enough to piece together the full puzzle. The red thread, that single bold line among the soft lavender and green, was the last clue, the one Miss Marple had seen from the start, a warning in plain sight. It didn't belong, just as the truth had never belonged to those who tried to bury it. Justice wasn't about courtroom victories, or loud declarations. It was quiet, like a stitch worked into fabric, unnoticeable to most, but ever present. Edith's confession would come, but not with the drama of a trial, or the finality of a verdict. She would be taken away quietly, her health failing, her mind unraveling as quickly as the secret she tried to hold together. And so the sampler, the symbol of all the lies and regret, would never be shown to the world. It would be locked away, its truth buried deep, just as the village moved on, oblivious to the undercurrents still running beneath the surface. But Miss Marple, with her ever-watchful eyes, knew. She saw the quiet tragedy that had unfolded, the small, steady hope of new beginnings, stitched quietly into the fabric of their lives. She returned to her needle, choosing green this time, a color for new growth, for healing, and for the unspoken promise that some threads, once lost, could be found again, if only you knew where to look. In Fernwood, where the gardens bloomed with calm propriety, and the streets whispered secrets beneath the surface, scandal was an old acquaintance, one that always seemed to slip through the cracks and vanish before it could be confronted. When Edith Bington had disappeared, quietly swept away under the veil of her declining health, the village did not erupt in outrage or sorrow. Instead, it folded the shame into its everyday rhythm, neatly tucking it away, where no one would have to see it. The quilting circle resumed. As always, a new raffle announced and Dora Lytton subtly taking the reins of the exhibition committee, though no one dared to mention Edith's absence directly. The sermon that Sunday was one of abstract reflections, a meditative discourse on sin, on forgiveness, and on the delicate, irreparable nature of broken things. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew, her hands folded, listening not just to the Reverend's well-chosen words, but to the hushed murmurs of the congregation, the glances exchanged behind gloved hands, the tension simmering just beneath the polite facade. Miss Marple noticed it all. The village had adjusted, but it had not reckoned with the deeper truth. Behind the solved crime, there lingered a murkier consequence, one no one wished to acknowledge. The quiet removal of Edith from Fernwood had been a quiet victory, but at what cost? The truth, like a hidden thread, had yet to be fully uncovered. On Monday afternoon, Miss Marple received a letter, written in a deliberate and elegant hand. The message was simple yet profound. Geraldine had written a letter to Marjorie the morning before she died. She forgave her. The words lingered in the air like the faint scent of lavender, bittersweet and haunting. Miss Marple's breath caught in her throat as she folded the letter slowly, the weight of its meaning settling in her chest. She rose, her steps measured, and made her way to the postman's cottage. Clive, the freckled man with a tendency to mumble, confirmed her worst fears. He had seen Geraldine drop a letter into the blue post box near the allotments, but the box had been out of service the next day. Rain had ruined the contents. The letter, the key to understanding everything, had likely been destroyed, lost to time and weather. Miss Marple thanked him, and walked away, a quiet determination in her steps. That evening, as she passed the old Fox cottage, now abandoned and forgotten, a single red thread caught her eye, fluttering from a thorn bush like a ghost from the past. Her fingers brushed it gently, releasing it from its tangle. Some threads, she thought, never truly disappear. They drift, they catch, and when you least expect it, they return to remind you of what was almost healed, but never fully repaired. Inside the cottage, Geraldine's sampler, her last act of forgiveness, remained locked away, untouched, its secret sealed away in a drawer by the constable's order. The sampler, with Marjorie's name, the symbol of the peace that never was, would never be displayed at the exhibition as Geraldine had hoped. Instead, the only legacy left behind was a hollow emptiness, a legacy marred by the pride that had kept them from forgiveness. The truth had come to light, but the forgiveness had never arrived in time. At the next quilting circle, Miss Marple stitched quietly, her fingers working methodically. Her usual sharp conversation was absent, her silence thick with unspoken thoughts. Mrs. Pratt, ever observant, remarked on it. "You're quiet today, Jane. That's rare." Miss Marple's faint smile was more somber than usual. "Sometimes, the fabric speaks for itself," she said softly, her voice trailing off. She knew, better than anyone, that some threads couldn't be unpicked, some wounds couldn't be healed. The tapestry of Fernwood, like the sampler, was unfinished. It would remain so, a quiet reminder of what could have been but never was. But before the women could turn their attention elsewhere, Miss Marple noticed the fleeting, thoughtful glance exchanged between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the cost they all bore, though none would dare speak it aloud. That evening, as twilight deepened, and the shadows grew long, Miss Marple sat by the hearth, the warmth of the fire casting flickering light across her features. In her lap rested the sampler from her own unfinished project, the green ivy border now completed, its edges curling as if time itself had gently embraced it. She added one final name to it, small and almost hidden in the corner, Marjorie. No pattern called for this addition, no need for it was ever mentioned aloud, but some things, Miss Marple believed, were meant to be remembered, even if the rest of the world chose to forget. A week passed, then two, and the summer clung to the land with a stubborn, oppressive warmth that refused to acknowledge the sorrow that lingered just beneath the surface. The bees returned to the gardens, their steady hum filling the air, and the children, eager with anticipation, began preparations for the harvest fete. At the old Fox cottage, now shuttered and abandoned, a real estate placard appeared, hammered into the ground with an air of apologetic finality. Fernwood, it seemed, was healing, or at least returning to its usual quiet rhythm, though it bore the scars of what had been. Miss Marple, in her quiet way, had tidied away her notes, each piece of evidence carefully tucked into a drawer. The sampler from her own project, with its ivy border and the stitched name of Marjorie, was pressed, framed and donated to the church bazaar in Geraldine's name. Few commented on the small discreet name, stitched into the lower corner. Those who noticed it said nothing. One grey morning, a parcel arrived at Miss Marple's door, modestly wrapped in brown paper, with no return address. Inside she found a folded sampler, but not Geraldine's. This one was simpler, less precise, yet somehow familiar. Lavender thread, narrow stitches, so like Geraldine's, but something was different. In the corner, where a violet might have been, was instead a delicate, pressed flower, fragile as ash. Miss Marple held it for a long time, her fingers tracing the threads, before setting it beside her teacup, and gazing out the window. So Marjorie had received something after all. Whether it had been the original letter, or merely the truth, she could not say. But someone, somewhere, had mourned, not loudly, not with grand gestures, but quietly and honestly. At the next parish gathering, Reverend Pottle gave a brief address, his voice carrying through the church with a weight that seemed to fill the room. Forgiveness, he said, is often imagined as a singular moment, a grand gesture, but in truth it arrives quietly, often late, and never without the presence of grief. Miss Marple, seated near the back beneath the church's high lancet windows, closed her eyes for a moment. A quiet hush settled through the nave. Not quite agreement, but understanding, an unspoken consensus that lingered in the air. In the final days of August, Constable Reeves paid Miss Marple a visit, though this time he came not with questions, but with a signed statement from Edith Beanton, carefully filed through the proper channels. The statement confirmed everything, though it seemed too late. I did not mean to kill her, only to stop her. The past should have stayed buried. I see now that it never was. I see now what it cost. Miss Marple read the statement once, then set it down beside her teacup, the weight of its words sinking in. Reeves fidgeted with his cap, a touch of unease in his posture, as if waiting for a response that would never come. We all believed the clue lay in the red thread, but Miss Marple, her voice soft but carrying a weight of quiet understanding, corrected him. It wasn't the red thread, she said, her eyes distant yet sharp. It meant something had changed, something subtle, a warning stitch perhaps, a mark of intention. Her gaze flickered to the detective's puzzled expression. Sometimes the truth doesn't appear where the needle ends, but where it breaks the pattern. Reeves blinked, taken aback, struggling to fully grasp her meaning, but he nodded, a slow understanding dawning. He was a good man. He would come to understand eventually. That evening, The Fernwood quilting exhibition opened in the modest church hall, its air filled with the scent of flowers and fresh-cut wood. The displays were simple: floral motifs, family crests, geometric borders, each piece lit by gentle lights and admired quietly by the villagers. But there was one piece that stood apart. In the center of the room, slightly off-center, stood a small embroidered square, framed in plain wood, stark against the more elaborate pieces surrounding it. No label, no signature. 2 chairs beneath a willow tree, one empty, the other draped with a lavender scarf, folded neatly over the arm. It was clear to all who saw it who it was for, yet no one spoke of it, and no one dared move it. As the last guests trickled out, and the lanterns dimmed, casting long shadows across the floor, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze fixed on the display. The hall, now empty, was filled with a hushed silence, the only sound the faint creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. She reached forward with the gentleness of someone who had seen too much but never enough, adjusting the frame ever so slightly, as though realigning something hidden just out of sight. Stepping back, she surveyed the display one last time, a soft sigh escaping her lips. Without a word, she turned, and as quietly as the night itself, gathered her coat. The door clicked shut behind her, and she stepped into the cool Fernwood night, the village holding its breath as if the air itself had paused to listen. In the distance, the faintest whisper of wind stirred the grass, a quiet, deliberate pull across the meadow, unbroken, like the final thread in a tapestry, too complex to understand, but impossible to ignore.